Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be taking a look at medical cannabis.
Sounds exciting.
It is a huge topic.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to filter out the noise as much as we can
Right.
and really get down to the good stuff. And to help us do that, we're going to be looking at a resource called the BudMed Bulletin.
This is a great resource. It's like a cheat sheet for understanding all the different facets of this really complex field.
Yeah, I like to think of it kind of like, you know how people talk about drinking from the fire hose?
Yeah,
When you're just bombarded with so much information.
for sure.
It can kind of feel like that when you're out there trying to get information about medical cannabis.
Yeah.
But the BudMed Bulletin really acts as a filter to give you just the good stuff.
Yeah, it cuts through all the noise and presents the research and personal stories in a way that's easy to understand.
Yeah, and it's curated by Leonard Landers.
Yeah, that's
So,
right. He's widely recognized for his expertise.
Yeah.
Really his unbiased approach to medical cannabis.
Well, let's jump right into it. One of the first things that jumps out from the BudMed Bulletin is their focus on chronic pain.
Mm.
And they start right off the bat by acknowledging that a lot of the conventional treatments just don't cut it.
Yeah. They paint a very stark picture of the problem that people are struggling with pain. They're relying on opioids, which come with all sorts of potential downsides. And that's where BudMed kind of flips the script and says, hey, there's this potential alternative.
Right. And what I really appreciate is that they back it up with scientific evidence.
Yeah.
They cite a lot of randomized controlled trials.
Right.
Which is really like the gold standard in medical research.
Absolutely. They highlight, for example, this scoping review of RCTs from 2012 to 2023 that found some really strong evidence for THC's pain-relieving properties. So they're bringing the receipts. You know what I mean?
We're not messing around.
They're not messing around. It's not just anecdotal. They've got the evidence to back it up.
And then they go a step further.
Mm.
I mean, not only do they say, okay, cannabis can help with pain,
Yeah.
but they get down into the specifics and they talk about how it impacts specific conditions.
Yeah. That's what's so great about it. They go beyond just that general statement and they look at, okay, chronic pain, but then they go even deeper. What about neuropathic pain, which is notoriously difficult to treat? What about conditions like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, where there's some anecdotal evidence that cannabis could be really helpful?
Right. It's really cool how they connect those dots and then they go even a step further and they include real patient stories,
Absolutely.
which just makes it so much more impactful.
That's what brings it to life. You can read all the research you want, but when you hear someone's personal experience with it,
Yeah.
it really hits home.
Right. And like, for example, there's a story of Bill who was dealing with chronic back pain and bipolar disorder.
Right.
And his story is just so powerful, and you can actually see it
You care.
on a National Geographic video. And then there's Mike, who is featured on CBS News. And his story is equally as powerful. He was dealing with terminal throat cancer, and he was using cannabis to help manage not only the pain, but also the anxiety, the insomnia, loss of appetite.
It's incredible how it can touch on so many different aspects of a person's experience.
Absolutely. And it really highlights that medical cannabis isn't just about treating a single symptom. It's often about improving overall well-being.
Yeah, it's a much more holistic approach.
Yeah. And speaking of different experiences, BudMed also does a great job of highlighting how cannabis can benefit women specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. They dedicate a whole section to women and medical cannabis.
Yeah.
And they talk about, the unique ways that it can be beneficial for them.
Right.
For example, they address the issue of painful periods or dysmenorrhea,
Right.
which affects as many as 90% of women.
90%.
It's mind-blowing how common that is.
It's crazy.
And, they cite studies where women experiencing this debilitating pain found relief with cannabis.
Yeah. It's amazing to think about the potential impact if more women knew about this option.
Right, absolutely.
And they also share the story of Lucy,
Right.
who is a mother who found relief from PMDD
Premenstrual dysphoric disorder.
with cannabis.
Yeah.
And she has this great quote where she says, "It's been life-changing,"
Wow.
which I think really gets to the heart of it.
Right. It's not just about masking the symptoms.
Right.
It's about actually improving people's lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as you can see, they're really going beyond just the surface level and really digging deep into specific conditions and how cannabis can impact them.
Mm-hmm.
And another one of those conditions that they talk about is neuropathic pain.
Yeah. This is a really interesting one because neuropathic pain is pain that originates from damage to the nervous system itself.
Yeah, it's not like a typical muscle ache or anything like that.
No. It's often described as burning, stabbing, electric shock-like pain.
That sounds awful.
It is awful, and it's really resistant to conventional treatments. But BudMed highlights a study from 2023, a study on spinal cord injury patients, where 87.9% of participants experienced over a 30% reduction in neuropathic pain using cannabis.
87.9%.
That's incredible. It's incredible, and it's a game changer for people who have been living with this debilitating pain.
For sure.
That just won't quit.
And not only that, but in that same study, 83.3% of participants were able to substitute other pain medications with cannabis.
That's right.
Which is huge.
That's huge, because we're talking about things like opioids,
right,
gabapentinoids, even over-the-counter meds.
Which could have huge implications for things like the opioid crisis.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is where cannabis really comes into its own as a potential harm reduction tool.
Right.
They present research showing that access to medical cannabis can lead to a decrease in opioid use.
Right.
And that's a huge public health concern.
Absolutely. So they're looking at all these different angles and really connecting all the dots.
Yeah.
And another condition that I found really fascinating is Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
EDS.
Which I'll admit I didn't know a ton about before reading this.
Right.
But essentially, it's a group of disorders that affect the body's connective tissues.
Yeah.
And it can cause a lot of different problems, like joint hypermobility to chronic pain.
Yeah. There's a whole range of symptoms.
Yeah. And BudMed actually highlights some anecdotal evidence from patients and doctors who have seen significant improvements in quality of life for EDS patients using cannabis.
Yeah. And there's even this great quote from a doctor who specializes in EDS,
Right.
who says that medical cannabis is one of the best quality of life medications for EDS,
Right.
especially when it comes to managing that chronic pain, fatigue,
Right.
sleep issues.
So again, they're tying together the science, the patient stories, the expert opinions.
Right.
To really give you a full picture of the potential benefits.
They're not just throwing research at you.
Right.
They're explaining why it matters.
Yeah. And they do it in a way that's engaging.
Absolutely.
And understandable.
And they're very clearly passionate about this topic.
Right.
And about educating people.
Absolutely. So I have to say, I'm really impressed with the BudMed Bulletin.
Me too. It's a great resource.
Yeah. And it's free.
Yeah. Which is amazing
Yeah.
because the amount of information they pack into each issue
Right.
is incredible.
Yeah. So if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend checking it out. We'll put a link to subscribe in the show notes.
Absolutely.
But before we move on to the next section, I just want to take a moment to kind of reflect on what we've covered so far. What stands out to you the most about BudMed's approach?
I think what really stands out to me is how they're able to take these really complex topics and make them understandable and accessible to everyone.
Right.
They don't shy away from the science.
Right.
But they explain it in a way that makes sense even if you don't have a background in medicine or research.
Yeah. And I think it's really important because there's so much misinformation out there.
Absolutely.
About medical cannabis.
It's really important to have a trusted resource.
Right.
That you can turn to for accurate and up-to-date information.
Yeah. So let's take a quick break and then we'll come back and continue our deep dive into the BudMed Bulletin.
Sounds good. One thing that really struck me was how BudMed tackled this topic of headaches and migraines, which are incredibly common conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And they present some pretty compelling research showing how cannabis can help.
Yeah, I mean, especially for people who haven't had success with conventional treatments.
Exactly.
It's a big deal.
Huge deal.
Yeah, and I was particularly interested in this section on migraines.
Right.
They cited a review of 34 studies.
Wow.
That found medical cannabis use was linked to a decrease in migraine duration and frequency.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, for people who suffer from migraines, that's a game changer.
Yeah, and they touch on cluster headaches as well.
Oh.
Which are much less common.
Yes.
But notoriously painful.
Incredibly painful.
And while the research on cannabis for cluster headaches is still limited, they do share a personal anecdote from Leonard Landers about his son, who successfully manages his cluster headaches with cannabis.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's, these personal stories, they really bring it home.
You do.
They make it more relatable.
Yeah, it adds a human touch.
Yeah. And speaking of, relatable and engaging,
yeah,
I love how they don't just present the research findings.
Right.
They explain why these findings are significant. Like, for example, they point out that cannabis could play a major role in addressing the opioid crisis.
Yeah, that's a huge one. And they highlight studies that have shown that access to medical cannabis can lead to a decrease in opioid use,
Right.
which has massive implications for public health.
For sure.
It's not just about managing pain anymore. It's about potentially saving lives.
Right. And one study they mentioned found that over half of the adults using cannabis for chronic pain reported decreasing their use of other pain medications.
Wow.
Including opioids.
That's incredible.
Yeah. Prescription painkillers, even over-the-counter medications.
Yeah. It really shows you the power of this plant.
It does, and it challenges a lot of the preconceived notions
Absolutely.
that people might have about cannabis.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's something that BudMed does really well.
Absolutely.
They challenge those assumptions.
Yeah.
And they present the evidence
Right.
in a really clear and accessible way.
They're advocates for the science.
They are
and for the
for the patients,
Yeah.
yeah. And they also focus on specific patient populations,
Right.
which I think is really important. Like they have a whole section dedicated to women and the unique ways that cannabis can benefit them.
Right. They talk about painful periods,
Right.
which we talked about earlier, how it affects so many women.
Yeah, 90%.
And they present research that shows that cannabis can be really effective for pain relief.
Right. I mean, it's amazing to think that there's this potential solution out there
Yeah.
for this incredibly widespread problem.
That's often overlooked
Right.
or dismissed.
And I think that's one of the main reasons why resources like BudMed are so important. Because they're bringing these issues to light.
Right.
And they're presenting the evidence.
It's giving people the power to make informed decisions.
Exactly. And it's not just about the physical benefits either.
Right.
They also talk about how cannabis can impact overall well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Mood, sleep, quality of life.
Right. And they cite research indicating that cannabis can have a positive impact on all of these areas.
Especially for people with chronic pain.
Yeah, I mean, helping people sleep better, feel less anxious,
Yeah.
have a more positive outlook on life.
Yeah, it's about the whole person,
It is.
not just the disease.
Yeah. And that's something that BudMed really emphasizes.
They're advocating for that holistic approach,
Right.
recognizing that everybody's is different
Right.
and everyone needs individualized care.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And they also talk about the importance of patient choice and autonomy,
Right.
pointing out that cannabis is often well tolerated
Yeah.
and preferred by patients over other options for pain management.
It comes down to empowering people
It does.
to make their own decisions
Right.
based on the information that's available.
And I think that's really what sets BudMed apart,
Agreed.
is that they're not pushing an agenda.
Right.
They're simply presenting the information
Yeah.
and letting people come to their own conclusions.
Yeah. They're that trusted friend who's done all the research
Right.
and is just presenting it to you in a way that's
What's
easy
the-
to understand.
Easy to digest.
And they're constantly updating their information.
Yes.
They're staying on top of the latest research.
Right. And actually, in the next issue, they're going to be doing a deep dive into cannabis and cancer,
Oh, wow.
which is a topic I'm really fascinated by.
Me too.
Yeah.
That's an area with so much potential.
So much potential.
I can't wait to see what BudMed has to say about it.
Yeah, it's another example of how they're really staying ahead of the curve,
Absolutely.
providing cutting-edge information,
Yeah.
insightful perspectives,
And again, it's all free,
all for free.
which is amazing.
Yeah, it's remarkable that a resource this comprehensive and well-researched
Yeah.
is available to anyone.
It really speaks to their dedication
Yeah,
to education
absolutely.
and to empowering people.
So before we wrap up this section, I want to ask you, what surprised you the most about the BudMed Bulletin?
I think for me, the biggest surprise was just how much they covered. I knew medical cannabis was being researched for a lot of different conditions, but the level of detail that they go into
Yeah.
is really impressive.
Yeah, and they don't just scratch the surface. They really dive deep
Absolutely.
into the specifics.
Yeah, and I love how they use those personal stories to really illustrate the points that they're making.
Yeah, it makes it so much more real and relatable.
It does. When you hear someone talking about how cannabis has helped them with their chronic pain or their anxiety, it just makes it so much more impactful.
Right, it's not just an abstract concept anymore.
Exactly.
It's a real person's experience.
And they don't shy away from the fact that there's still a lot that we don't know about cannabis.
Right.
They acknowledge that more research is needed.
Yeah.
And they advocate for a cautious and informed approach.
Yeah, which is really important, I think.
Absolutely. It's not about pushing an agenda.
Right.
It's about empowering people to make informed decisions about their own health.
And I think that's really what makes the BudMed Bulletin such a valuable resource.
Agreed.
It's informative.
Yeah.
It's engaging.
And it's empowering.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited to see what they cover in the next issue.
Me too.
Right.
Especially that deep dive into cannabis and cancer.
Yeah, that's a topic that has so much potential.
I think it's an area where we're going to see a lot of exciting developments in the coming years.
Yeah, and I have no doubt that BudMed will be at the forefront of those developments.
Absolutely. They're doing amazing work.
So to wrap things up, If you're interested in learning more about medical cannabis, I highly recommend subscribing to the BudMed Bulletin.
It's a free resource.
It's free.
And it's packed with valuable information.
Absolutely. You can find a link to subscribe in the show notes, and trust me, you won't regret it.
Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll see you next time.